In the name of God, hello everybody. My name is Mehdi Kortnavasi, and this is the first movie of the software architecture and design, chapter 1. What is software architecture? Let's start. The process of defining a structured solution that meets all of the technical and operational requirements while optimizing common quality attributes such as performance, security, and manageability. It involves functionality, usability, resilience, performance, reuse, comprehensibility, economic and technology constraints, trade-offs, and ASIC concerns. The highest level breakdown of a system into its parts. The decisions that are hard to change. There are multiple architectures in a system. What is architecturally significant can change over a system's lifetime. And in the end, architecture boils down to whatever the important stuff is. The software architecture of a program or computing system is the structure or structures of the system, which comprise software elements, the externally visible properties of these elements, and the relationships among them. Architecture is concerned with the public side of interfaces, private details of elements, details having to do solely with internal implementation are not architectural. So, in a design a model, we will not concern to the details.
Enterprise architecture is a rigorous approach for describing the structure of an enterprise. A well-managed enterprise architecture results in an effective enterprise. Enterprise architecture is really three things. Firstly, it's a discipline. As a discipline, it's a way of thinking about the structure of an enterprise. An enterprise architect is a professional with know-how, skills, and aptitude in this discipline. Secondly, it's a process. There are processes for architecting an enterprise. They cover how architectures are created, how they evolve and change, and how they're managed. Finally, enterprise architecture is a set of work products, a set of models and representations that describe the structure of an enterprise. Enterprise architecture provides a specific approach for understanding and describing the structure of an enterprise in a rigorous way. This gives us a big picture view of the constraints and limitations imposed by the current structure of the enterprise. Architects can then show what options exist to change or make improvements by embedding better target structures. Enterprise architects produce pictures, diagrams, plans, and roadmaps that explain the current limitations and show how changes can make things better. They follow processes to take into account the opinions and views of all stakeholders and make the best of available resources and investments.
Let's continue with another question. Why is architecture important? Like any other complex structure, software must be built on a solid foundation. Failing to consider key scenarios, failing to design or common problems, or failing to appreciate the long-term consequence of key decisions can put your application at risk. Modern tools and platforms help to simplify the task of building applications, but they do not replace the need to design your application carefully based on your specific scenarios and requirements. The risk exposed by poor architecture includes software that is unstable, is unable to support existing or future business requirements, or is difficult to deploy or manage in a production environment. Systems should be designed with consideration for the user. The system means the IT infrastructure and the business goals. For each of these areas, you should outline key scenarios and identify important quality attributes, for example, reliability or scalability, and key areas of satisfaction and dissatisfaction. Where possible, develop and consider metrics that measure success in each of these areas.
There are so many definitions of enterprise architecture out there that it's hard for anyone to pin it down. So in this video, we'll just attempt to go over some generic definitions and so on that will hopefully give you an idea of what enterprise architecture is about. Well, let's begin by breaking the term down into its component pieces. First of all, enterprise. Generically, an enterprise is any organisation, whether that be a company, a charity, or a government department or agency. On the whole, however, we tend to think of enterprises as being relatively large organisations, potentially collaborative collections of various organisations with some sort of shared set of objectives or goals that they're trying to meet. The second part is architecture. At its most basic, anything has an architecture. Living things have an architecture, chemical compounds have architecture. It's anything with a complex or carefully designed structure. On the whole, however, we're trying to think about systems of various different sorts. Think of a whole enterprise as a system. So an architecture for us will be a description of the structure, i.e. its components, and its behaviour, what processes and functions it has as a system. But we also tend to talk about architecture as a verb, doing architecture, which is any sort of activity required to produce such a description of an architecture. So let's talk about enterprise architecture and define that. Well, this is the documentation describing the structure and behaviour of an enterprise, which includes its information systems. How much of it is IT and how much of it is business is something we'll discuss a little bit later. Go back and have a little review of the last 20 years of EA and what's been changing there. Again, the verb here is enterprise architecture is doing the process for describing an enterprise, which includes its information systems, and then planning and governing changes to improve the integrity and flexibility of that enterprise. To go further into what is enterprise architecture, a lot depends on the sort of framework you're going to use. And there are lots of frameworks out there. Some popular ones are things like TOGAF by the Open Group. And there are smaller frameworks such as Zachman's framework. How do we differ between these frameworks and what do frameworks involve? Well, frameworks have different aspects to them. We talk about the architectural content, the structure of the architecture. The meta model is a term you'll often hear used. Frameworks often also describe processes. What activities, what order the activities need to occur in. And often a framework will also describe the organisation, the people, the roles involved in doing the architecture. If we take TOGAF, TOGAF covers all three of these. If you compare that to Zachman, Zachman is purely a content framework. Let's talk about breaking down the content a little bit more. Large enterprises can be very complex, so we need ways of reducing that complexity, so we're dealing with smaller chunks. The first way is to segment up that organisation. So if the enterprise is made up of subsidiary companies, or if it's a big government department with many agencies, then there's obvious ways of segmenting that out. The second way we can break down these complex systems is by looking at different domains. And if you look at most of the frameworks, they'll talk about typically 4 domains. The first domain is the business architecture. The point of business architecture is that this is the reason the organisation exists. So it covers things like the business's objectives, goals, strategic thinking, and also then covers things like what capabilities the business has, what processes, what functions, what organisational structure that business domain has. The second domain is the data or information architecture domain. This has an overlap with the business architecture. Typically, the business will have its own view of data and information. However, the data domain on the whole in the architecture frameworks tend to then start to look at it in the information systems layer. The other half of the information systems layer is the application or applications domain. I won't go into the distinction by using the S here. This is focusing on the IT applications, applications which offer services to the business. And we have a little triangle going on here between business, applications and data. Applications are there to help manipulate the data on behalf of the business. And the applications provide these application services up to the business, which in turn the business architecture is there to describe the business services being offered, either internally or externally to customers and so forth. And the final domain of the 4 typical ones is the infrastructure or technical domain. This is the platform domain in many ways. It's the nuts and bolts, it's the wires, but it's also the system software, etc., upon which the applications and the data architecture is dependent. So if you look at these 4 domains as a whole, the way we're representing it here is with these overlaps. These overlaps show where the business maps to the data architecture and the business architecture maps to the applications architecture, and how the data and applications architecture are dependent on the infrastructure layer. And typically these are presented in some sort of hierarchical format, where the infrastructure layer offers services upwards to the applications, which offer their services upwards to the business, which offers its services upwards to the outside world. Those are the 4 main domains in many architecture frameworks. There are other domains which organisations want to focus on. For some organisations, security is incredibly important, so a security domain which cuts across all of these other domains is seen as important. Other organisations think compliance is enough, to have a specific compliance architecture being overseen as its own domain. If you go and look at some of the frameworks, like the frameworks for Department of Defence in the US or the Ministry of Defence in the UK, DODAF and MODAF, you'll find all sorts of interesting domains in there which we won't talk about here. Let's now talk about what architects actually do, what activities they perform. And there are various different areas that they're concerned with. First off is to create these architecture descriptions. We can have architecture descriptions for each of those individual domains, and obviously they have to be consistent and mapped to each other. Typically, if we're going to be performing any sort of change, we need to have at least two sets of descriptions. One is the baseline descriptions, which describes our current as-is situation, and the other is some sort of future or target set of descriptions. And these typically represent the strategic vision of the organisation or enterprise, where they want to be in 3 to 5 years' time. That gap may be a little bit large, so you may have various other intermediate architecture descriptions as sort of stepping or milestones, if you like. With our baseline, intermediate and target domains, we can now start to compare them to see where the gaps are, the differences, what needs to change in these architectures to enable the organisation to move forward. What we can then do is begin to put together some sort of strategic migration plan as to how these various different gaps are going to be filled. And these are going to drive off the individual change projects and programs that an organisation is going to follow over the next few years. Enterprise architecture is then not actually about doing the changes or performing the changes, but about overseeing those changes. It does this by defining various architecture principles and the standards, etc., that need to be followed by the various program and project teams. Architects are then expected to govern those change activities just to ensure that the standards and principles are being followed and the plans are going to achieve what the organisation actually needs. Why do organisations do enterprise architecture? Well, this has changed over the years, which is why we potentially have so many different definitions. If we go back to the early days, back to the 1990s and the early 2000s, a lot of enterprise architecture emerged out of the IT function. It was very much about dealing with the problems of the day. We had siloed IT systems which didn't interoperate with each other or share information, and businesses wanted to have business processes that cut across these silos, etc. So that was a big issue in IT 15 to 10 years ago. More recent times, however, that sort of issue isn't a problem. There's lots of middleware and lots of tools out there to help you get things talking to each other and interoperating. So the focus has now changed more onto the business architecture. And a lot of organisations, TOGAF included, have really started to beef up the business architecture aspects. And this is very much about enabling the businesses to change. IT is very much now seen as the enabler of change in many organisations. A good agile IT architecture is going to allow businesses to apply changes to processes, capabilities and so on a lot quicker than if they had these old rigid architectures in place.
Okay, thank you for watching this movie. In the next movie we will continue and start with the question why is architecture is important. Thank you very much.